There are so many fighting games to play, and as we all get older, it becomes less and less realistic that we'll have a chance to experience them all properly. Even if we just look at the titles we see on main stage, it's pretty easy to get stunlocked trying to pick one to invest serious time into. The list of potential candidates for your Wednesday night grind session expands rapidly when we start to consider old games too. Fightcade gives us an overwhelming access to near perfect online play on countless titles with no real requirement bar a working PC from later than the 90s. On top of all of that, it's not 2009 anymore, and fighting games aren't just created by powerhouse developers like Capcom, SNK, Namco and Arxis. More than ever, we're seeing a rise of indie fighting games, made by any and all configuration of small teams. But why? There are already too many games to play, so where do they sit in the scene, and what purpose do they serve that games with a bigger backing can't? Honestly, it's a pretty tough question to answer, not because there aren't any answers, but because there are too many. Indie games have an endless amount to offer, from unique aesthetics to incredible soundtracks, but I'll be real, that's not what's interesting to me. What's interesting is, as always, the mechanics. Triple and double A franchises have huge development costs, and they have to make that money back, especially for games that are going to receive near constant updates and new content in the form of season passes. This games as a service style of development means teams are kept on games for years and their pay has to come from somewhere. The quality of fighters in most cases has risen dramatically over the years, and hopefully the pay for the developers, QAs and everyone else involved reflects that. It does pose a potential issue, however, one that's manifested a couple of times. These games have to sell, not just a couple of units, but a ton. What this means in reality is that the game needs to be safe and fit neatly into what is considered to be expected norms of a modern traditional fighter to appeal to the biggest audience possible. I personally don't believe this is the only way to reach that audience, but I do see the logic. It's not always the case, but what we can be left with is a game that starts out mechanically a bit stale. It will often evolve into something more interesting with subsequent updates, but that can take time. Indie games do not have the same financial obligations. Of course, they do have some, and I'm not trying to downplay the pay deserved for the insane hours that these developers put in, but for obvious reasons, it's not on the same level. It is in large part due to this that these fighters have produced some of the most fascinating interpretations of our genre. We've got turn-based fighters, isometric grid fighters, browser fighters, shmup-inspired fighters, and the list really does just go on. One title I've personally found really interesting is Arcus Chroma. This game features no jumping. There are moves that can make you airborne, but the core mechanic of holding up and going into the air is gone. Now, typically these sorts of games don't really do it for me. I'm not the biggest fan of fighters removing core features, not to say this type of game is bad or anything, but personally, I find that stripped back games don't really hit the spot. Not trying to chat shit on people who make or enjoy them, simply just not my cup of tea. That being said, this game is different. Yes, it does not have a jump, but it functions less as a reduction of complexity and instead a reallocation. Jumps, of course, have the potential for huge amounts of nuance and interest through their application and counters. Arcus Chroma, however, leans into instead enhancing every other aspect of the game to compensate for their non-existence. It's got reverse beats, rolls, teleports, dodges, long range buttons, lingering projectiles, universal overheads. The ground game is so fleshed out and well considered. I mean, god, some characters even have purpose built anti-air buttons, and you'll quickly realise when playing that they actually need them. Another aspect I really appreciate is the fact the game, although it features some very unique cast members, also has some pretty cut and dry archetypes. It allows you to see the developer's thought process in taking someone like a grappler and transitioning them into a world where they can't jump, which is a pretty inspiring piece of mechanical problem solving. Whether we like it or not, fighting games as a genre will evolve, and the conversation around that isn't just limited to motion inputs and monetization. We need unique interpretations of what is considered normal to push forward innovations, so we're not just left with slight variations of the same expected gameplay for the next 20 years. Perhaps we're not going to reach the conclusion that all fighters shouldn't have jumps, but there is more you can learn from how this game functions as a developer than most AA games, because its limitations force fascinating solutions. Realizing that you can make a deep, compelling title without a core function that's been there from the genre's inception is nothing short of a miracle, and experiencing how it's done is worth your time, be it as a thought experiment for the curious, or just someone looking for a great game doing something vastly different than everyone else. Don't get me wrong, the games I have presented thus far are not gimmicks. They're titles you could put as many hours into as a game with 100 times their budget. But if you're looking for something more traditional, the indie devs have, of course, got you covered. We've got spiritual successors to Third Strike, we've got air dashers, we've got versus games, we've got platform fighters that basically function like Guilty Gear, and we've got a classical 2D fighter inspired by titles like Super Turbo, called Shattered, created by Team 18K on Twitter, whom you should politely bully into giving me early access to. Another indie title on the more traditional side that has completely captured my attention is Easelaf 2. It's a classic style of air dasher that oozes personality in both its design and mechanics. Easelaf 2 is a complete package with rollback and continued updates found through the game's Patreon for literally £4. There's a lot to love here, but for me what stands out is the characters' power levels. It's kind of reminiscent of Guilty Gear Plus R or Super Turbo. Every character, when viewed within a vacuum, has a mechanic or situation where they seem completely unreasonable. What the hell is this character's movement? Why is this character playing golf? And oh god, look at this mix-up. But when you look at them in the larger context of an average matchup, it's actually pretty balanced. I really like this style of design. When you first load up a character in training mode, you pretty immediately find something wild and will desperately want to learn how to abuse it in a real setting. There is nothing boring and nothing mediocre here. Everyone is operating on an incredibly high power level that, outside of a few exceptions, feels tangibly old school. I say this because a lot of modern AA developers want their games to be balanced quickly, and the fastest route to balance is homogenizing the cast as much as possible, removing weaknesses and strengths. This other style of balance that operates in the extreme simply takes more time from both the developer and players to hone, but the advantage is we start with characters and mechanics so exciting that you can genuinely lose yourself in them. I really just can't recommend this game more. Over the years, it's become increasingly obvious that some of what made older titles unique and let them stand the test of time wasn't always intentional. One of the main focuses of this channel has been discussing well-known glitches in fighters and how they improve the game or turn it into something more unique. If we're being honest, roll cancels couldn't exist in modern games, nor the VACC, nor crouch cancelling, But these are all glitches that are often considered to define their respective games in a beautiful way. If you're a big studio with the ability to update your games, you will take them out. They would be considered game breaking or too esoteric otherwise, which technically they are. Indie development teams and the way they're structured in general allow for a much more immediate response to the emergent gameplay presented by the community, as they can react faster, not needing to get approval from huge chains of command that just want their game to appeal to everyone. We've seen this happen a couple of times. Rushdown Revolt famously implemented glitches found in earlier versions of the game as core mechanics simply because they made the title more fun. Even old glitches from legacy titles can be found in indie games, notably push block guard cancel, which was originally from the Versus series and got implemented into Skullgirls as a technique properly balanced for and explained within the tutorials. Before we conclude this video, I need to properly note something so people don't get the wrong idea. I have no issues with big budget modern titles. A lot of them are absolutely fantastic. The point is that indie titles can offer something they do not, and the same can go the other direction. This is something we all know because it's true of indie titles outside of our genre. What I want to highlight here is how amazing it is that fighting games have grown enough that we now have indie titles to check out which try to cater to all manner of different playstyles and tastes. I genuinely believe that the future for indie fighters looks more and more promising each passing day, and most of these titles are under 15 bucks. Maybe you play them for one weekend with your mates and a couple of beers, or maybe you form a lifelong bond with them. Either way, it's a low barrier for entry to experience something that might completely change the way you think about our beloved genre.